So I'm pleased to be joined today by my old friend Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the founder and president of J Street, and we've known each other for a long time. Agree on a lot of things, but also disagree on some things as well. And one of the things that we've disagreed with about just very recently is that. As some people may know, I went to speak at Tel Aviv University and then apologized for doing so. And Jeremy wasn't a big fan of my decision to apologize and wrote a piece about that. And I thought it would be good to have that conversation. So, Jeremy, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to just echo, my gratitude for your ongoing dialogue about our disagreements. And I think that we share a lot of the same values and we're coming from a really good place, both of us, and just look at things a little bit differently. And it's great that we can model how to have that discussion for folks.
Yeah, I totally, I always find these kind of conversations valuable. So, Jeremy, why don't I just turn it over to you to tell me, to tell folks why you think this was a mistake, and then we'll go back and forth about it.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I feel most strongly about,
Mhm.
it's one of the core founding principles of J Street, it's part of my DNA, is how important it is for people to talk with those with whom they disagree. And it is really important for communal spaces, whether they're academic like universities or in our case, synagogues or other Jewish communal venues, to make space for dialogue and disagreement and debate. I view it as core to the Jewish DNA, to disagree. And I tend to react badly to any effort from the right or the left, from any, perspective, up, down, left, right, whatever you want to call it, to try to shut down debate and discourse and to tell people they shouldn't speak in a particular place, or, the particular place shouldn't have a particular type of person, or, this is welcome, that's not welcome, and it becomes litmus tests and all of that. And so I have a very strong negative reaction against that. And
Hmm.
I think it's very important to go to, as your initial post actually made the case, to go to a place like Tel Aviv University where there is a relatively open-minded student body. I mean, I think these some of the more liberal folks in Israel go to Tel Aviv University, and I think for them to hear the perspective from America of what some parts of the Jewish community are beginning to think about what's happening in Israel, what was done in Gaza, I think it's so important for them to hear it. And then, to feel that there was some kind of a litmus test imposed on you as to where you should or shouldn't speak. And then when you apologize for it, it just really, it didn't sit well with me. And it went against all those core values that I have about open debate and dialogue and discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you. I those values are really important to me as well. I mean, it's part of the reason I talk to you, but even people who are much further afield from you. I mean, I've done conversations recently with Elliot Cosgrove, who denounced Mamdani, and Shabbos Kestenbaum, who's kind of a pro-Trump activist, and Israelis like I read Benny Morris. And so I agree with that principle very, very much myself. I think the reason that I reconsidered, and it happened after a bunch of conversations with Palestinians in particular, whose opinion I really trust, and I was really trying to think about the arguments they were making, had to do with the nature of speaking particularly to this institution. I actually had spoken the night before in Jerusalem at an event that was co-sponsored, that was kind of organized by the Educational Bookstore in East Jerusalem, and had plenty of Israelis there, and there was no issue because the institution where I was speaking wasn't complicit in what Israel's doing. But one of the points that people made to me that I think I didn't think enough about beforehand was that yes, Tel Aviv University has some terrific scholars and some of whom are my friends, and some of whom have views that are probably not very different than mine or of yours. But it is institutionally very much interbound up with the Israeli military industrial complex. It literally has like a venture capital firm that has been involved in investing in some of these drones that have been done even so much to damage in Gaza. And so I began to think, is there something different about speaking to individuals, who are Israeli, and speaking at this particular institution, which Palestinians have been pointing out is really complicit in this? And the second thing was about just the nature of the nonviolent movement itself. I believe that it's really important for writers, intellectuals to be able to follow their own conscience. I don't, and not to and to make my own decisions just like anybody else. And I have disagreed with the BDS movement. I disagreed with their criticism of No Other Land. I disagreed. I wrote something about disagreeing with their criticism of Standing Together. But I also think that um, when you were in the wake of what you and I have both come to believe is a genocide, and you have a nonviolent movement because we don't want more October 7th, God forbid, right? And we that there is such an importance in nonviolent resistance and struggle that there has to be a good reason to disagree with that. And that given that, because I really do think that if we don't support Palestinian nonviolence, we're likely actually to see more Palestinian violence because people are just not going to sit back and accept their oppression. And so, not that there aren't times where I'm going to disagree with BDS, but that in this case, I didn't have a good enough reason at the end of the day. Again, because there were other opportunities to speak to Israelis that wouldn't have made me complicit in Tel Aviv University. It was a very difficult decision, but that's why I came out where I did.
So I wonder if you would acknowledge a difference between
Mm,
nonviolent resistance, which I,
yeah,
completely agree. And I think,
yeah,
you've written a lot about this, and
yeah.
there's obviously a whole line of academic study about the
Yeah.
role of nonviolent resistance against oppression, and that's an important thing. But I worry sometimes that the nonviolent movement
Mm,
becomes oppressive itself,
mhm,
and the way in which weight gets thrown around
mhm,
you know, try to prevent other people from interacting.
mhm,
To me, that's not nonviolence.
mhm, mhm,
When people are saying, for instance, the standing together, or
mhm,
you
mhm,
shouldn't. I'll take J Street, right? I mean,
mhm,
the idea that the J Street is worse than
mhm,
some of the instruments of Israel's power, and that you shouldn't engage with J Street, and
mhm,
we want to bring people to Israel in order to hear and see those voices of Palestinians and to
mhm,
understand what is
mhm,
happening there. And then those Palestinians are pressured by this so-called nonviolence resistance
mhm,
movement, not to
mhm,
meet with J Street,
mhm,
not to meet with members of Congress that we bring,
mhm,
creating an atmosphere of intimidation.
mhm,
I don't feel like the BDS movement, as it is being sort of run by its
mhm,
leadership,
mhm,
is actually fulfilling the principles that underlie,
mhm, mhm,
nonviolent resistance. Not only will there never be an end to this if there isn't a nonviolent movement, but there
mhm,
also isn't going to be an end to this if there isn't a coexistence movement. If there
mhm,
isn't a effort to bring Israelis and Palestinians together at the people to people level. You mentioned Standing
mhm,
Together. There are 150 different groups that are part of the Alliance of Middle East Peace, and they are
mhm,
all, whether it's, they're playing ultimate frisbee, or they're singing, or they're doing medical work, or whatever, efforts to bring people to people work together. And then you get pressure from the BDS movement that
mhm,
somehow
mhm,
this normalizes, oppression, and normalizes the
mhm,
occupation.
mhm,
And Palestinians and Jews are pressured not to participate
mhm,
in what I think is fundamental to resolving this
mhm,
conflict, which is
mhm.
building that dialogue and understanding of each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think nonviolent resistance also has costs. I mean, right? I mean, and, the BDS movement is modeled on the South African anti-apartheid movement, and that had costs. I mean, people said in South Africa that if international companies don't invest in South Africa, Black South Africans are going to lose their jobs. Oftentimes, they would say sometimes that the international companies were treating their Black workers better than the South African companies, and there was truth in that. So, I don't think there is a process of any kind of pressure, even if it's nonviolent, that doesn't impose costs. It would be much better if we lived in a world in which such costs were not necessary, in which people in Israel could kind of wake up in the morning and say, this is wrong and it's not ultimately in our interest. But I think, unfortunately, oppressive systems don't usually change. I think almost never change unless they meet resistance. And so I agree with the importance of, I think coexistence is absolutely the ultimate goal. And I believe in dialogue with people I disagree with. But I also think that unless there is pressure and there are costs imposed, I don't want those costs to be in blood, unless there are costs, that Israel is going to continue on the path that it's on, which is a path of deepening apartheid and now genocide. And so I think that the goal can be coexistence, but you can still recognize the importance of there being nonviolent pressure to get towards that goal.
but I would think you would want to impose the cost on the people doing the oppressing, right? I mean,
Hmm.
that's where I just don't get it.
Hmm.
When the pressure is placed on a group that is trying to build dialogue and build debate,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
pressure is placed on a group, let's say, again, I'm going to just be self-serving here and say if
Hmm.
pressure is placed on a group like J
Hmm.
Street that
Hmm.
is actually dedicated to ending the
Hmm.
occupation and trying
Hmm.
to do this oppression,
Hmm.
then how does that cost help? What you're actually doing, not you, but I
Hmm.
mean, what the
Hmm. Hmm.
movement does
Hmm.
then is they shrink their coalition.
Hmm.
What their goal should be is to win
Hmm.
and to build the broadest possible coalition. And they're not going to
Hmm.
agree with everybody in their
Hmm.
coalition on everything. But when they shut people out and say,
Hmm.
we can't deal with you because you're not pure enough and you haven't
Hmm.
done everything exactly the way
Hmm.
we want,
Hmm. Hmm.
you're actually cutting your nose off despite your face, and you're
Hmm.
making the potential coalition
Hmm.
to overcome the oppression much smaller rather than much larger.
I mean, I'm not a representative of the BDS movement, so I actually think that this would be a really interesting conversation for you to have with someone, someone who was. Again, I know there are Palestinians who have very different views about this question and about engaging with J Street or engaging with lots of other different organizations. And again, my basic instinct is like yours to believe in the value of talking to people who have different points of view. For me, it really came down to the question of the particular case made against Tel Aviv University and whether I felt that I could say there's something so unique about speaking at Tel Aviv University that I couldn't have in some other set of conversations with Israelis, that it's worth violating this basic principle of the idea of a boycott. And so I felt like it was a high bar in order to be willing to do that. This is again, I don't think any movement is perfect, and I think all movements deserve to be criticized and subject to public criticism. But I also think Palestinian politics has not been able to function in any has been so destroyed, right? Israel has fragmented Palestinians, has told Palestinians when they can hold elections, who can run in those elections, has put so many of Palestinian leaders in jail. And so I think the BDS movement, which was created by Palestinian civil society, is something that a lot of Palestinians and other people look to as a nonviolent movement that has some legitimacy and can put pressure and speak in the voice in the within the language of human rights and international law. Again, does that mean it shouldn't be criticized? No. I think Palestinians criticize it. Other people should always have the right to criticize any movement. But to me, I felt like the bar for defying it and speaking at Tel Aviv University was I had to be able to say there's something so there's the kind of conversation that I can only have at Tel Aviv University that I can't have in other places, that it's worth undermining this. And after I started having those conversations with folks that I really trust, I felt like I didn't have a good answer to that.
And I, would be happy to have this conversation
Mhm.
if you
Mhm.
wanted to sponsor it, here, because I
Mhm.
feel
Mhm.
very strongly that the BDS movement, the way that it is being run, is actually doing a disservice to the very cause
Mhm.
that they claim to be
Mhm.
promoting. And some of the most fierce critics about what
Mhm.
they do are
Mhm.
Palestinians themselves, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we work very closely with the Palestinian residents of some of the villages on the South Hebron Hills.
Mhm.
And the South Hebron Hills villages that are under attack by settler terrorists are,
Mhm.
still holding on by a thread in large part because of the work of Israeli Jewish human rights organizations and Jewish political pressure in the United States and around the world that keeps international attention on this and prevents
Mhm.
really the full erasure of these
Mhm.
communities in the South Hebron Hills. And
Mhm.
these activists, the Palestinian activists from those villages, come under intense criticism from the
Mhm.
BDS movement for
Mhm.
working with Israeli human rights groups and working with rabbis who go out into their olive groves and do protection work. And
Mhm.
it's insane to me that
Mhm.
that the BDS movement is criticizing the Palestinian residents of these villages for working with
Mhm.
Jews and working with Israelis.
Mhm.
It no longer is a sensible theory of change. It's no longer a sensible way of achieving the goal that one wants. What it really becomes is it's almost, a Stalinist or Maoist, litmus test, of purity. Like you just
Mhm.
can't deal with Israelis. You can't deal with Jews. It's
Mhm.
anti-normalization.
Mhm.
And I feel like it,
Mhm.
I would urge you to listen to other voices, not just those from within the BDS movement.
No, absolutely. I mean, I know that as that, Palestinians are not monolithic. No group of people is monolithic. And I've talked to many Palestinians over the years and over the last week who have very different views about all of this. So I think that's normal. It's healthy that people would have a different point of view. I think that my my position is, again, as someone who, as a writer, is that I feel like ultimately I have to be true to my own conscience. So that means that whether it's any movement that I might generally be sympathetic to, whether it's the labor movement in the United States or the movement for racial justice in the United States or the movement for, any movement, right? The climate change movement, right? It's wrong for any individual to basically surrender one's own conscience and decision making. But I think that, to me, one of the fundamental lessons for this to me is just the importance of listening very carefully. And I don't think that's what I did before I went to speak, because especially when I am in a position, just through the luck of the draw randomly, that I was born as an American Jew. So I have full citizenship here. And I also have, I'm also, because of being a Jew, I am some ways, I have also the benefit of supremacy there if I decide to go live there or want to travel back and forth. And this is a group of people who, through just, the luck of the draw, have been born into a situation in which they lack basic human rights. And I think that, to me, listening to people who've had that experience is just one that I can't really understand, to a multiplicity of voices. The process, the method is really important to go through. And that's where I felt like I kind of fell down here. And so that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah. And I think the listening really is important. And,
Mhm,
I'll give another example. Like,
mhm,
we try to bring Palestinian speakers to the
mhm,
US. You know
mhm,
that, we've
mhm,
done a lot of work together over the years
mhm,
in terms of speaking or,
mhm,
events around the country. We want to educate. We want
mhm,
Jewish communal spaces to hear these voices that they don't normally hear, right? I mean, you've written a lot about this, the need to
mhm.
listen to
Yes.
Palestinians. And so we make arrangements for Palestinians to come here. And who's trying to thwart it? You've got the
Mhm,
Trump administration on the one hand trying to
mhm,
thwart it, because they don't want anybody coming into the country. You've
mhm,
got the
mhm,
Israeli government that's trying to prevent people from
mhm,
even going through Ben Gurion Airport to
mhm,
get here.
mhm,
And you've got the BDS movement that's putting
mhm,
pressure on these folks not to come and speak. And then you have the Jewish community here putting pressure on the institutions not to let them speak. I mean,
mhm,
at every turn, the one thing that everybody's trying to stop is stopping people from hearing voices. And I think the listening is really important, but there's
mhm,
not just one voice to listen to. There's just a wide range of voices. And I think that what I
mhm,
felt did
mhm.
not live
Yeah.
up to your
Yeah.
standards was
Yeah.
I thought you gave into this pressure
Mhm.
from one voice.
Yeah, for me, it was really a bunch of people talking so I talked to, and I think for me the critical question was, I mean, it became really clear to me that I was going to be people were going to be really unhappy with me either way. That I really have succeeded in making people from a wide variety of ideological perspectives really, really unhappy with me. So it was a good week in that regard. But I think for me, what ultimately it came down to for me was, I'm going to have to defend some position that's going to make some people really unhappy, which is a position that I feel like I can defend more effectively and more convincingly. And I felt like in this particular case that I didn't have a good answer to people like Noura Erakat and others who had basically said, there are other ways of speaking to Israelis that don't require speaking at an institution which is complicit in what's been done in Gaza. I think that in general, I think that, I agree in the idea that more dialogue is better. I also think it's really important that remember that the dialogue is two ways, and that we allow ourselves to be challenged, so that, that J Street is open to the challenges that BDS makes, or people support BDS make of J Street, with some of which I share, in terms of why don't what about the right of Palestinians to have the right of refugee return, for instance, right? Or is it really true that you could have a Jewish state in which Palestinian citizens are always, also are equal? And so I think that, but those are the kind of, I think the dialogue is important to goes both ways, in which we listen and we also, ask other people to listen. And I think it's also just always important to remember, as I've tried to to remind myself, that there are power dynamics that structure these things as well, where I tend to have a much bigger platform often than many other people, for not because I'm any smarter than them, but just because basically I have certain inherent advantages, and I have to try to be aware of the way in which that can structure the nature of dialogue.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with you as well. And I think it's very important for people to hear views they don't agree with. And I think that the debate is important, not just for the people having it, but also for the
Mhm,
audience.
mhm,
Part of the benefit of these discussions is not necessarily, I'm not going to convince you, you're not
mhm,
going to convince me,
mhm.
or whatever the pairings are in
Yeah.
debates. It's really the audience that benefits,
Mhm, mhm,
from hearing a crystallization of the different points of view. And so, I do believe, as you know,
mhm,
that it is possible for there to be a state of the Jewish people that is the national homeland of the Jewish people, and at the same time to treat all of the people that live there the same under the law. That it is possible to reconcile those values. That is my belief. I'm unlikely to be convinced that I'm wrong, but I think it is really important for me to have the discussion with somebody who doesn't think I'm right in
mhm,
front of an audience that really hasn't formulated their opinions yet, because
mhm,
I think
mhm,
the audience deserves the benefit of hearing both of those. And again, I find from the BDS movement,
mhm,
and again, I know you're not a spokesperson
mhm,
for
mhm,
them, but one of the things I find most frustrating is that a movement that is for freedom and is for
mhm,
rights
mhm,
tries so hard to prevent people from having those arguments and those discussions in front of
mhm,
wide audiences so that
mhm,
people can
mhm.
make their own minds up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there are ways to have those conversations in ways that don't make one complicit with particular institutions, but I think that it's an ongoing conversation, and I think that you and I had an earlier conversation about the basic principles about the nature of Jewish statehood, and now we're having another one about the decision I made at Tel Aviv University. So I hope this will be just one in a sequence of different conversations we have about our disagreements, and people can listen and make up their own minds.
Yeah, and the good news is that I do believe, and I take a lot of heat for whenever I say this, but I do believe that you and I do agree about more than we disagree.
Mhm, mhm,
Fundamental values that we believe in,
mhm,
and the fundamental wrongs that are happening, and the fundamental mistakes that are being made by institutions of our community. I mean, there are a
mhm.
lot of things that we do agree on. We just take different approaches to getting to, hopefully a better future.
Yeah, and also we're differently situated. I mean, I'm just one guy, who pops off my mouth. And J Street is an institution that I mean, tell me if you think about it differently, that is working in a political system with a particular theory of change having to do with the way the American government works. So I think even beyond the fact that you and I have different life experiences and may think differently intellectually, we're also just differently situated in terms of how we think about our roles.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, J Street is, as you said, we're a political actor, and what
Uh-huh.
we're trying to do is shift the political landscape, and shift the political center of gravity. And that's just going to require strategic choices that are going to be different. And that's why I so respect, I think there is the need for a civil society pressure campaign against things that are wrong, right? I mean, I
Uh-huh.
think that is not what J Street is. I have enormous respect for that, but change,
Uh-huh.
as we know from so many crises over the course of
Uh-huh.
human history. Change is only going to happen when a variety of these strategies work in synchronicity next to each other. And it is a shame sometimes when there's attacks across the aisle, when we are trying to get somewhat to the same place and we're
Uh-huh.
fighting more with each other than with the people, that we actually should be doing the fighting with.
Yeah, and then there's that other interesting question, which is, are the goals exactly the same, right? Because,
Yeah.
there also may be a difference about fundamental ultimate vision, and that's also important to have that argument too. Um, Jeremy, I'm really glad we had the chance to do this.
Yeah, no, and thank you for having me on. I'm really glad to always have these conversations, and thank you for your writing, thank you for your work, and let's continue to disagree amiably.
I look forward to it. Take
All
care.
right, perfect.